April 1st, 2008, reporting live from Bucharest, Romania in Eastern Europe. What's the Plaid Avenger doing here on April Fool's Day? Why, because I've got the best fool of them all. Here's your 2008 April Fool. That's right, it's President George Bush of the United States of America. Now, why would I be calling him a fool? Well, I'm sure you can fill in the blank for many, many reasons that you're thinking of. But the reason the Plaid Avenger is saying that he's this year's April Fool is because he is here in Romania, as am I, for the big NATO summit this year. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is meeting in Bucharest, Romania, starting tomorrow for the next 3 days. Why is he a fool for coming to NATO? Because of one thing that he's here pushing hard for. In fact, the primary reason he came. He ordinarily doesn't even show up for these things. Usually other folks do. But a whole bunch of heads of states are going to be here this year, including G.W. Bush. And the reason he's a fool is because he's pushing hard for NATO to accept the Ukraine and Georgia into their NATO club. Now, what a fool! Why would the Plaid Avenger think that he's such a fool for suggesting this? Because it ain't going to happen. There are a whole bunch of reasons why NATO is not going to accept the Ukraine of all countries or Georgia into their club right this second. Let's start with a real obvious reason why the Ukraine's not going to get into NATO. One, the Ukrainians don't want into NATO. It's the most bizarre thing ever. George Bush touched down in Ukraine yesterday to meet with the president of Ukraine, President Yushchenko, the guy who was disfigured horribly in a poisoning accident while he was running for president several years back. He is a big pro-Western guy. He's all about joining the EU. He was all about joining NATO years ago himself. And now he's hosting George Bush to compound the gavel and say, yes, we want our Ukrainian brothers in NATO. However, unfortunately for Bush, for Yushchenko, and for everybody else who's a big NATO fan, 70% of the country doesn't even want in. Here's the only thing you got to know about Ukraine right this second, my Plaid friends. They used to be part of the USSR. They had tight relations with Russia. And in fact, the Russian mother country controlled the Ukraine while it was part of the USSR, and lots of Russian people lived there. In fact, if you were to look at the Ukraine on a map, the western side of the Ukraine is very pro-West. They're all about NATO, they're about the EU, they're about becoming European. However, the eastern side of Ukraine is very Russian, and they're more pro-Russian. They want to cozy back up with the Russian motherland as opposed to joining NATO and pissing off the Russian motherland. So only, at best, 30% of Ukrainians even want into NATO. So that's reason number one. They're not going to join NATO. Reason number two has already been alluded to. Pissing off Russia big time. Who wants to do that nowadays? Our main Russian man, Vlad the Man, Putin, has been saying for years, no, nyet. No Ukraine in Russia. No Ukraine in NATO. Not going to happen. All right? Does anybody really want to cross this guy? He's a black belt judo master. He'll crush your neck with his bare hand like a walnut. You don't want to mess with this guy. And he's all about saying, hey, this used to be part of Russian territory. We admit it's now not part of Russian territory, but we feel that the NATO is encroaching too close to Russian borders. We've complained in the past when you let places like Poland, like the Czech Republic, like Slovakia in, and we complained more when you let Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in. But come on, the Ukraine, that's too much. That's too close to the heart of our empire, and it's really pissing us off. You already know this too. Putin's already pissed off about the whole U.S.-led missile defense shield that they want to put into Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe. That's already pissing the Russians off. This idea that you're going to let the Ukraine, a huge country by all accounts, that abuts the heart of Russia, join NATO, ain't going to happen. Russia has been pissed about it. Putin has already said there's no way they're going to let it happen. In fact, he already came out and said, if Ukraine joins NATO, if Georgia as well joins NATO, we will repoint our missiles at them. Do you really want to mess with this dude? I don't. All right? And I'm a superhero, and I ain't messing with him. So the idea that Russia's going to go along with this, no matter what sweet bait George Bush tries to give to Putin next week when he meets with him, Putin ain't going to take it. They're going to hardline, and they have a bit of economic clout to do so to make sure Ukraine doesn't join. Right? That's lesson or number 2. First is Ukrainians don't want it. 2, the Russians don't want it. Particularly the Russians don't want it. But number 3, could it get funnier here on April Fools? Some of the Europeans don't want it. And some important ones to note. The Frenchies and the Germans have already come out and said, no, we don't want them to be part of the NATO club either. Now you might ask yourself, wait a minute. NATO was formed as a counter to the growth of the USSR. There is no USSR anymore, so many question whether it should even be around anymore. But let's pretend like it still should be around. The Germans and the Frenchies are saying, well, Russia's not our enemy anymore, and we're pissing off Russia by doing this. We're not so keen on pissing off Russia. Why would the Europeans, particularly the Frenchies and the Germans, not want to piss off Russia right now? Could it be, maybe, perhaps, because they get anywhere from a quarter to half of their energy resources from Russia? Again, to restate for the 10th time, does anybody want to piss off Russia in Europe? The answer is no. And the Frenchies and Germans have already taken it off the table. They're saying no. All right? We're part of NATO. We're core members of NATO. We're not going to let it happen. 4th reason, related to the 3rd. The Frenchies are all about reasserting their power here all of a sudden. We might have to do a separate Plaid Avenger story on the Frenchies. These guys are on fire. Under our main man, Sarkozy, with his hottie wife. He is reasserting France's power, not just in Europe, not just in the world, but within NATO too. Here are a couple things you probably didn't know about. Our main man Sarko, the Frenchie, with all the balls, has said, hey, here's a couple things I want to do. 1, I want to reassert France's position as in a leadership role of NATO. Wow, that's cool. Sarkozy has already promised more troops to the NATO-led mission in Afghanistan. He's saying, hey, we're French. Oh, we're French. We are powerful. We got nuclear power. We should be at the executive table at NATO, a place they have not been invited to for 40 years. So the French are ponying up to NATO. On top of that, European ministers are saying, hey, it's time to have a real EU military that's separate from NATO altogether. And the Frenchies are all about that too. They're saying, hey, we're French, we're powerful. We shouldn't rely on the U.S. and NATO for everything. We should have an EU force. We should take care of things at home, things like Serbia, things like the Balkan Peninsula blowing up again. We should have an EU force, and France wants to lead that. Wow, that's new, and that's cool. Finally, 5th and final reason, Ukraine ain't getting into NATO. Georgie, what are you thinking of? 5th reason is, because Georgie, you're a lame duck. Meaning, he's out of power in 9 months. This idea that President Bush and El Presidente Cheney are going around the world making these grandiose gestures and saying they want all these big foreign policy initiatives is all fluff. No country in their right mind, not even the Ukraine, nor Russia, nor France or Germany, is putting a whole lot of stock in some new initiative by a U.S. president who will be out of power in 9 months. Well, why not? I mean, he's the president of the U.S. Shouldn't we do everything he says? Well, because there's going to be a new president. It would be one thing if George was running for his 2nd term, or if Cheney was changing the Constitution so they could run for a 3rd term. Don't rule that out, by the way. But these guys are gone. Their 2nd term, they're finished. There's someone new in the White House in 9 months, come hell or high water. Okay? So the rest of the world is saying, we're not cutting new deals. We're not going to get all worked up about this. The idea that the Bushies are going to push for this new initiative and change NATO just before they leave, it's not going to happen. Right? So even the NATO officials are probably just shaking their heads going, okay, okay, George, sure. We'll look into that whole Ukrainian thing. That's the Plaid Avenger story for today. The 5 reasons that G.W. Bush is the April Fool, asking for Ukraine to be admitted to NATO. 1, the Ukrainians don't want it. 2, the Russians don't want it. 3, the Frenchies and Germans don't want it. 4, the Frenchies are reasserting their role in the world and they don't want to mess with Russia right now. And 5, he's a lame duck. That's your 5 reasons why NATO ain't taking no Ukraine, not today. That's all for today. Want to know more about what's happening in NATO, what's going on in Russia, what's happening somewhere else in the world? Then tap into plaidavenger.com, send me a line, a question, a mission, and I will solve it for you.